Hey everyone, Crow back here again to talk a bit about the 13 games, including the Evercade's 4th arcade collection, Atari Arcade 1. I don't know if I really need to explain anything about Atari. I mean, they're perhaps one of the most well-known names in the video game industry, and they're known for their classic arcade titles, game consoles, and computers they created throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The company has changed hands and names several times since its inception in 1972, going from Atari Inc. to Atari Corporation to Atari Games. But Atari really started to cease to exist in its original form in 1996, when Atari Games was sold to the owners of Williams, Bally, and Midway. By 1999, the Atari name was no longer being used. In 1998, the Atari name and assets were sold to Hasbro Interactive, and in the year 2000, Infogrames took over Hasbro Interactive and started using the Atari name, creating new games under the name as well as licensing out Atari's legacy games, like the ones in this collection. There are many additional details I omitted for time, but the main takeaway is that the Atari of today is very far removed from the Atari of the 70s and 80s, which is when all the games in this collection were originally released. So I'll briefly talk about each game in the collection, whether or not I liked each game, and afterwards I'll rank them from my least favorite to my most favorite. Let's begin! Well, let's start out with Canyon Bomber, which was released by Atari to arcades in November of 1977. This is a very simple black and white game for 1 or 2 players, wherein you release bombs into a canyon aiming for the targets with the highest point values. If playing as a single player, the CPU takes control of the second player. The game starts out in slow-moving blimps, but as the game proceeds, you'll be swapped into faster-moving planes. The controls for this game are incredibly complicated, so you might need a pen and some paper to take some notes as I describe them. You've got a button which will release a bomb. That's it. You cannot control the blimp or plane in any way, shape, or form. The entire challenge of the game is with adjusting the timing of your bombs with the speed, altitude, and direction of your aerial vehicle, which will change with every pass of the canyon. The game ends for each player when you miss targets 3 times. Oh, and if you pass over the canyon without dropping a bomb, it counts as a miss. Now, I'm pretty familiar with the Atari 2600 version of this game, and in fact, it was one of the games included in the very first Evercade cartridge, the Atari Collection 1, and I wasn't particularly fond of that game, and I never really have been. So I've never really given the arcade version a chance, and you know what? After playing for about 30 minutes or so, I realized I was kind of liking this game. I started thinking, what's the difference between this version of the game and the 2600 version? I looked back at the footage of the 2600 version and a few things stuck out, like how you can miss 6 times instead of 3, the resolution is a lot lower so the canyon isn't as big, and the target's point values are harder to decipher. Ultimately, in this arcade version, everything isn't so cramped and convoluted, so it's a lot easier to strategize where you want to drop your bombs. And the bombs fall a bit more realistically, and the 3 miss limit really intensifies things later in the game when there's only a few targets left to hit. On the 2600, I just kept dropping bombs hoping to hit something, whereas in this arcade version, I can actually identify where I'd want to drop a bomb and are given the chance to do it with the proper timing of the bomb release. I wasn't really expecting to come away with this version of the game liking it, but I do. In Atari Collection 1, we got the Atari 2600 version of Centipede. In Atari Collection 2, we got the Atari 7800 version of Centipede. And now finally, in Atari Arcade 1, we are getting the arcade version of Centipede, which was originally released to arcades in 1981. Now, since this is already a well-known arcade classic, I'll try to go over the details of the game quickly. Basically, you control a bug blaster that can maneuver around the bottom 20% of the screen, shooting at spiders, fleas, scorpions, but primarily the centipede descending from the top of the screen. The screen is littered with destructible mushrooms that can impede your shots and also act as a wall for the centipede, causing it to descend the screen faster. Shooting a centipede segment will cause the mushroom to spawn where it was shot, and shooting the centipede in the middle of the segment will cause it to split in 2. And that's it in a nutshell. It's a simple game on the surface, but it has a lot of mechanics going on in the background that an expert player can take advantage to get those higher scores. Now, Centipede is a game I really like, but one problem with most home ports, including this Evercade release, is the lack of trackball support. The original arcade game used a trackball, and using a trackball or a mouse is absolutely the best way to play this game, as it allows you to move fast when you need to, but also slowly and accurately when you need to make precise shots. Playing with a joystick just doesn't give you that. As I played this on the Evercade, I found myself constantly twitching the controller around, trying to get a shot lined up, and in a game where the action is fast-paced, not being able to hit what I want quickly is a good way to lose a life in short order. Now, I still like this version of the game, but I would have liked it even more if there was trackball support. It's entirely possible that the Evercade VS will eventually have trackball support with a future update, and if that does happen, I will definitely reevaluate this game. But unless that happens, to me, this is just an arcade version of Centipede with a bug blaster that's more difficult to control. Here we have the sequel to Centipede, Millipede, which was released in 1982, about a year after Centipede. Millipede is basically the same game as Centipede, aside from some changes and a whole slew of new stuff added to give the game a bit more variety and an added challenge. One of the more unnecessary things that was added was a story that puts you in the role of an archer defending the forest from insect monsters, or something like that. I mean, it really doesn't matter. As far as I can tell, the only returning creature from Centipede is the spider, and he behaves exactly the same way as he did before. Some of the creatures from Centipede have been replaced with other insects, but they behave the same way as the creatures they replaced. The fleas were replaced with bees, the scorpions replaced with earwigs, and of course the centipedes were replaced with millipedes. The entirely new creatures with new behaviors are the inchworms, dragonflies, and mosquitoes. The playfield behaves a bit differently as well. The mushrooms, of course, return and behave the same as before, and the area in which you can move in is the same, except now it's clearly marked. But the most obvious new addition are the DDT canisters, which will explode when hit, emitting a poison cloud that will kill insects within its range. Flowers can also appear in the playfield, created when a beetle crosses a mushroom, and it's something that cannot be damaged by your arrows. Not just that, but the playfield can now advance forwards or even backwards depending on certain actions taken in the game. So like Centipede, it's a game where there's a lot of game mechanics going on that expert players can take advantage of, even more so in this game than Centipede. As for myself, I was pretty much drawn on which game I liked better, Centipede or Millipede, but I think I've got to go with Millipede just because of how much more chaotic the game can be. It can make the game harder, but it also makes the game more fun to me. However, on the Evercade, we have the same problem here that we had in Centipede, and it's the fact that Millipede is meant to be played with a trackball, and as of this video, there is no trackball support. Playing the game with a joystick or a D-pad is doable, but I find it a little frustrating to try and dial in certain shots. It's a hindrance for sure, but at the same time, it doesn't kill the game for me. Released in arcades in 1983, Crystal Castles is another game we've previously had on the Evercade, albeit it was the Atari 2600 version that was included in Atari Collection 1. Bentley Bear is trapped in the Crystal Castles, and in order to get out, he'll need to collect all the gems in each maze-like level. Well, that can't exactly be true because there are monsters roaming the castle that will also take or devour the gems as well. Regardless of who collects the gem, Bentley proceeds to the next level when there are no more gems on the current level to collect. The monsters in the game include skeletons that lumber around, trees that can move surprisingly fast, a swarm of bees that will occasionally appear, and gem eaters that only care about eating gems. Berthilda the Witch will appear every 4 levels, and she can only be eliminated if Bentley is wearing the magic hat, which grants temporary invincibility. To me, this game is like if you took the Pac-Man formula, created multi-level mazes with an isometric view, included a variety of different monsters, and added in some hidden secrets and warps to boot. There are a lot of people out there that are fond of this game, and I'm not one of them. Now, I happen to have the Centipede Arcade 1-Up cabinet, and Crystal Castles is included in it, and every once in a while I'll pop it on out of curiosity, and maybe I'll find out why people like this game. But I just can't find the appeal. But at the same time, I wouldn't say I don't like the game. However, for me, there's a problem with the Evercade version. The arcade controls for Crystal Castles uses a trackball. And since there's currently no trackball support for the Evercade, you're stuck using a joystick or D-pad, and this makes Bentley Bear really difficult to control. Maybe it's just me, I don't know. To me, it's not exactly the easiest game to control, even with a trackball, but the digital inputs of a joystick make control utterly frustrating to me. I'll frequently miss gems, stairs, elevators, all because I have no precise input. I must have muttered, "I hate this game," at least once every few minutes while I was playing it, and probably more frequently the further in the game I progressed. I may have found this game barely tolerable with a trackball, but playing this arcade version on the Evercade with a joystick, I can definitely say it's not for me, and I won't be wanting to play this one again anytime soon. Back in August 1979, Atari released a vector graphics game about landing a lunar module on the moon called Lunar Lander. It was created based on the 1973 DEC game Moon Lander, which is actually the first graphical version of these lander-type games because, believe it or not, these types of games had existed even in text-based iterations as early as just a few months after Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969. In Atari's Lunar Lander, the goal is to land successfully on the moon as many times as you can with a limited amount of fuel at your disposal. Every action you take burns at least a little fuel, so the goal is to land successfully using as little fuel as possible. Points are awarded based on how well you land the module, multiplied by the difficulty value of the landing location selected. If you crash into the lunar surface, you are penalized by losing some fuel, as well as not scoring that many points. The game ends when all the fuel is used up. The controls in the arcade unit consist of 2 buttons to tilt the lander left or right, a thrust lever to control propulsion, and an abort button that will automatically straighten your lander and apply maximum thrust for a few seconds at the cost of a ton of fuel. Now it's up to the arcade operator to adjust how much fuel a player gets per credit, and this Evercade version sticks with the default of 750 units per credit, although, just like in the arcade, you can add in multiple credits per game to increase the amount of fuel you have. You can even add credits in the middle of the game to extend your playing time. With Lunar Lander, it seems to be a game people either like or hate, and I happen to like the game. It requires patience and some precise control to make a successful landing without burning too much fuel. I find the game relaxing, although we really aren't getting the arcade experience here. As mentioned, the arcade unit has a thruster lever, and it's an analog controller used to determine the strength of the constant thrust, and every home version of the arcade ROM that I've played, including the Arcade 1-Up unit, replaces that lever with a simple thrust button. And with that change, the gameplay feels different since now you're tapping a button instead of adjusting a lever. I did find it surprising that the version here on the Evercade lets you select one of the 4 level missions, which will change the gravitational force and some other factors. The only problem is that you'll have no idea what mission you've selected. The actual arcade unit would light up on the control panel what mode you've selected, but since we can't see the control panel on the Evercade, it winds up being a mystery unless you remember exactly how many times you've pushed that select mission button. It's a good thing they added that reset option recently, because that's the quickest way I know of to reset the mission mode back to the easiest level if I've lost track. And what do we have here? Why, it's another arcade game on the Evercade where we had an Atari 2600 port in the first Atari collection. This time it's Missile Command, and that was originally released to arcades in 1980. You take control of 3 bases to defend your cities from incoming nuclear missiles. Simply place the cursor where you want to aim your anti-ballistic missiles, and press one of the 3 buttons to fire from the corresponding base. The goal is to neutralize the enemy threat by disabling anything they throw at you with the explosions from your anti-ballistic missiles. You'll have to aim carefully since you have a limited supply of missiles in each base, and if you let anything slip by your defenses, it could mean losing a city or a missile base. While missile bases are regenerated in between each round, cities are only gained when certain scores are reached. The game is over once all the cities have been destroyed. But I probably didn't need to mention any of that. Missile Command is a popular enough game that just about everyone is already familiar with it one way or another. And if you are familiar, then you might remember that the arcade version of this game uses a trackball to control the cursor, But to be honest, I actually don't mind using a regular joystick for this one. I mean, sure, a trackball would be better, but I think the reason I don't mind might just be because of the fact that I've played the Atari 2600 version so much that I may just have gotten used to using a joystick for this game. I don't think you have to be that precise when aiming in this game, so that may be why I feel like this game might get away with it. So yeah, I do like this arcade version of the game, and oddly enough, I probably like it just as much as the Atari 2600 version, and I can see myself swapping back and forth between the two versions of the game. That's pretty much all I have for this game, but I thought it interesting to mention that I didn't like playing this game when I was a kid, and it wasn't because I didn't think the game was fun, but rather it was because this was one of those games where you would always lose no matter how well you did. And even though there are always games like that where the game just gets progressively harder until you eventually lose, it was the fact that in this game, losing meant the complete annihilation of 6 whole cities, and it was completely your fault that you couldn't protect them. Even though the game was a fictional scenario, I guess the stakes were just a little too high for me. Released to arcades in 1982, Liberator feels like a direct follow-up to Missile Command while not actually being a sequel. In fact, Liberator is most commonly described as Missile Command in reverse, since the gameplay isn't too dissimilar. The main difference is that in Missile Command, you are defending ground targets from an aerial assault, whereas in Liberator, you are attacking ground targets from the planet's orbit. The controls are very nearly the same as well, where the main focus is positioning a cursor on screen to direct your ship's fire and try to destroy your targets by getting them caught in the resulting explosions. One of the main differences is that you're firing from 4 ships, one in each corner of the screen, but you don't choose which one is firing. The game automatically fires from the ship that is closest to your cursor. It hardly matters anyway, since in this game you've got infinite ammo. Your ships also have a shield that can be deployed to destroy most things that get too close to them. However, they will eventually degrade into nothing the more times things come into contact with it. The main goal is to destroy all the bases on the orbiting planet below you, but you'll also have to defend your ships from the incoming fire as well as the bases protecting themselves. Destroying all the bases on the planet will advance you to the next level. And to change things up, occasionally you'll encounter some spacecraft that'll try to take out your ships before you reach the next planet, and the game ends when all of your ships are destroyed. So I was curious as to what the story behind this game was, because on face value it just seems like I'm going from planet to planet attacking everything I see. Well, the story isn't exactly easy to find, since no site I looked the game up on would exactly describe what it was. But eventually I found out that the narrative of this game was included as a comic book titled Atari Force Codenamed Liberator by DC Comics, and it was included as a 15-page special insert in 2 other comic books, which were DC Comics Presents number 53 and the New Teen Titans number 27. So I eventually tracked down a copy of it online and read it. And here's a quick synopsis. In the distant future of 2005, the Atari Force discovers that a race of frog-like creatures known as the Malaglon have inhabited several planets, enslaving the populations in subterranean concentration camps. They defend their conquered planets with several missile bases scattered all over the planet that can launch heat-seeking missiles, killer satellites, and special saucer crafts that can fire an unblockable death ray. They also have the ability to change the speed and the direction of the planet at will, which makes it harder to target some of their bases. The Malaglons have been advancing towards Earth, so the decision is made to stop their advance and liberate their enslaved worlds. Well, that's basically the plot, but the comic also points out that the 4 ships in the corners of the screen are actually just probes being controlled by a much larger ship named, appropriately, Liberator. So at the end of the day, it's good to know that we are freeing enslaved planets and not just, attacking and conquering each planet for ourselves, which is what it seems like without that story. Well, it seems like I went a little heavy on the story here, but I'll have to say that I do think I like this game, but definitely not as much as Missile Command. For some reason, knowing the story behind the game makes me like it just a little bit more, which almost seems kind of silly since the story really has nothing to do with the gameplay, but I guess a little narrative as to what's actually going on does add a little something. Would you be surprised if I told you that this next game is another arcade version of a game we previously got an Atari 2600 version of in the Atari Collection 1? Probably not. As you can see, we're talking about the 1976 released arcade game Night Driver, which may be the first arcade driving game from the driver's point of view. Of course, the graphical capabilities of an arcade game from 1976 are pretty limited, but the game gets away with this by not having to show anything on the screen except these little white sticks that indicate the edges of the road. You know, because it's night. The image of the front of the car is actually just a decal on the actual arcade unit, so the game doesn't have to waste resources drawing that on screen. Happy to say that this decal is accurately simulated in this version of the game on the Evercade. In Night Driver, you are given the option of 3 tracks: Novice, Expert, and Pro. The goal is to score as many points as you can before time runs out. It's about 100 seconds per race. Points are given based on the distance traveled, though you do earn points faster per distance traveled based on the difficulty of each track. There's nothing on the road that can stop you, except hitting the side of the road, which will bring you to a complete stop. If you can reach 350 points before time runs out, you'll earn more time. And that's something I've yet to accomplish myself. Now, I don't really like the Atari 2600 version of this game, not on original hardware nor in Atari Collection 1. However, I have played this arcade version before at Galloping Ghost Arcade, and when I did, I was surprised to find that I actually liked it. The controls are the gas pedal, the steering wheel, and a 4-gear shifter. No brake pedal though, but that's okay, you don't need to worry about braking. I was curious as to how this was going to play on the Evercade. My biggest concern was the steering, since there's no analog control. And you know what? I was surprised to find the game controlled perfectly fine with the D-pad on the game's controller. I was totally expecting to have all sorts of trouble steering, but nope, it's perfectly serviceable. Granted, a steering wheel or analog control would be better, but the D-pad control here is perfectly fine. And I had to use a regular game controller for this one and not my trusty arcade stick because of the rest of the button placements for this game. The R1 shoulder button is used for accelerating in the game, and the 4 face buttons A, B, X, and Y are used for each of the car's 4 gears. And again, it all works perfectly fine. Oddly enough, the only real complaint I have about this game is that it has the same problem as Lunar Lander. You can choose the track difficulty, but there's no on-screen indicator of what's been selected. To further complicate things, the in-game controller display and the game manual both show difficulty selections 2 different ways. In-game, it indicates that the L1 button changes difficulty, and in the manual it indicates that the 3 game modes are mapped to the X, A, and B buttons, 1 for each mode. I'm not really sure which is correct, though I suspect that it's hitting L1, and I'm not 100% sure when I should be hitting those buttons to make my selection. But other than that complaint, I did enjoy playing this one. More than likely, you're all familiar with Pong. Released in 1972, it was Atari's very first video game, probably the reason it's in this collection. This simplistic table tennis game is sometimes erroneously claimed to be the very first video game, but it's not. Hell, it isn't even the first table tennis video game, in that it's often been claimed that the Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game was the direct inspiration for the creation of Pong. Regardless, Pong became so successful that it generated several imitators that were known as Pong clones. In 1975, Atari released a home version of Pong that was also very successful, and it too also inspired many clones. However, the version of Pong here on the Evercade is supposed to be the original arcade version, and believe it or not, for as simple as Pong is, it isn't exactly the easiest game to emulate. In fact, Pong wasn't even initially available in MAME and wasn't even added until November of 1999, and then it was removed a few months later in February of 2000, and it wasn't added again until 2012. And the reason for all of this is that there really is no ROM for Pong. The first time it was added to MAME, it was simulated and not emulated. This means that new code was written to approximate how Pong worked, and in order to truly emulate Pong, you've got to emulate all the discrete circuits that make up the hardware. And this functionality wasn't added into MAME until 2012. So the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because I'm not really sure if Pong on the Evercade is being emulated or simulated. But there are several inconsistencies I'm seeing in the Evercade version. In the arcade version, when you power up the machine, it stays in attract mode until a coin is inserted. But in this version, the game starts immediately after it's loaded. In the arcade version, the game ends when a player scores 11 or 15 points, depending on how the operator sets up the game. But bizarrely enough, this version of Pong never seems to end. Finally, the arcade version requires 2 people to play because there is no single player mode, but in this version, the computer instantly controls the second player paddle, and if a second player joins in, they'll take over for the computer, and the game doesn't even restart or anything. These are a few flaws which lead me to suspect that this game is being simulated, which honestly to me wouldn't matter, but these flaws really impact the game. And that's aside from the fact that this is another game in the collection that requires analog controls that the Evercade doesn't yet support, if it ever does. In short, I find controlling the paddles in this version very frustrating. So in the end, it's primarily the lack of analog control that makes me not enjoy this version of the game, but all the other issues certainly don't help it. I suppose Blaze could fix all the issues with a firmware update, but it wouldn't be until analog controls are supported that I would even begin to be on board with this version of the game. Back on the Atari 2600, one of the games my sister and I used to enjoy playing was Skydiver. Well, this is the arcade version that was released a year prior in 1978. Both versions of the game have the same basic concept, but the rules for each are a bit different. The basic concept is having your Skydiver jump out of a plane, releasing the parachute, and landing on your target. The longer you wait to open the chute, the more points you'll get if you land on your target. You've also got to pay attention to the wind because it will affect your Skydiver after he opens his chute, and while you can adjust his landing by pushing left or right, a strong wind may make it impossible to move in the opposite direction the wind is blowing. And that's where the similarities between the two versions end. Even though the 2600 version has multiple game modes, none of them play like the arcade. In this arcade version, you're not limited to the number of jumps you can take, but the game is over when you miss the target 3 times. Also different is that the plane the Skydiver jumps out of will continue to move faster and lower the more successful jumps are made. Also, the longer you wait to open your chute, the smaller the target zone gets. Finally, in some of your jump attempts, one of the letters in the word Skydiver may begin to flash. Successfully land that attempt and you'll earn that letter. If you manage to earn all of the letters in Skydiver, your points will be doubled for the rest of the game. Now for me, this is one of the better games in this collection. I've always liked the 2600 version of Skydiver, and the differences in this one certainly make it interesting. It's one of those games that I kept replaying again and again and again to see if I could beat my high score, or better yet, spell Skydiver for double points. If you do play this single player, the computer will control the other player, but I still wound up just focusing on score since the computer doesn't really play this very well. Lastly, I just want to say I always get a kick out of seeing the failed jump attempts. It was funny to me in the 2600 version, and it's funny to me here as well. Here we have the 1978 arcade release of Super Breakout, the sequel to Breakout, which was released about 2 years earlier. Basically, this is the same brick breaker game with a ball and paddle. The game may appear to be in color, but it's really a black and white game with a color overlaid, which the Evercade is simulating. To improve upon the original Breakout, Super Breakout offers 3 different game modes to choose from: Progressive, Double, and Captivity. In Progressive mode, the wall of bricks will slowly descend the more times the ball is hit. In Double mode, the player will control 2 paddles at different heights, and each round will start with 2 balls. And in Captivity mode, there are 2 balls trapped within the wall of bricks, and if they are set free, you can play with the freed balls as well. If you can play with 2 active balls, all the points are doubled, and if you're good enough to free both balls and have 3 active balls, all points are tripled. Regardless of the game mode, there are some things that remain the same, such as having 3 attempts per game, the rate at which the ball speeds up, and the point value of the bricks. Basically, the higher up they are, the more points they're worth. The one thing that always really bothered me about Breakout and Super Breakout was that once you break a brick of a certain height, the ball immediately starts moving at its maximum speed. The shift in speed almost always throws me off. Also annoying is the way these games punish you for reaching the top of the screen by shrinking your paddle to half its normal size. And I thought the paddle was small enough already as it was. But the paddle shrinking isn't something I need to worry about in this Evercade version, because I'll never be able to make the ball reach the top of the screen. This is one game that really requires the precise movement of a rotary analog spinner like the actual arcade unit. When you translate it to use digital controls like a D-pad or a joystick, you lose the precise control, and I can tell you that just like Crystal Castles and Pong, it's incredibly frustrating to play because I always felt like I had very little control and it was just luck every time I managed to hit the ball. The only reason you're seeing halfway decent game footage is because I was using save states. A lot. And I just edited the footage to make it look seamless. I'm also extra annoyed because I had to play this a lot longer than I wanted to, since the first time I captured footage, it failed to capture the game audio. I never want to play this again, unless analog controls are somehow implemented. Warlords was another one of my favorite Atari 2600 games, and here we're getting the arcade version, which was released in 1981. Well, there are actually two arcade versions of Warlords, a regular upright cabinet model and a cocktail table version. The regular cabinet version had an overlay that reflected a backdrop image of castle walls and battlegrounds, while the cocktail table version did not. However, the cocktail version supported up to 4 players, while the cabinet model only supported up to 2. The version in this collection is the cocktail table version, and it was more than likely included to take advantage of the Evercade VS's ability to support 4 players. In Warlords, each player must defend their castle in one of the 4 corners of the screen. At the beginning of the game, a dragon spits a fireball at one of the 4 castles, and it's up to the player to control the shield protecting the castle to deflect the fireball away. The player can also hold the fireball with the shield for a limited amount of time and catapult it back in any direction, producing a more powerful spinning shot. If a fireball gets inside the castle, it's destroyed and that player is out of the game. As each castle is destroyed, or just as time passes, more fireballs will be introduced into the playfield. The game ends when there are no more human players left. And that's an important distinction because the computer will take control of any castle not controlled by a human player. The human players are warlords, while the computer players are black knights, all indicated by the image in the castle. If 1 or 2 human players are playing, the game is considered score-based, and if the black knights are destroyed, then the player or players advance to the next round with more difficult black knights to defeat. If 3 or 4 human players are playing, the game is considered a free-for-all, and the scoring is removed entirely. A 3 or 4 player game will always end once there is only 1 castle remaining. So here we have another game that requires an analog spinner to play, and I was not looking forward to playing this with a joystick or D-pad. But surprisingly, I found it perfectly serviceable in this game. Obviously, an analog spinner would be a much better option, but I never really felt frustrated by the controls while I was playing this game. And while I never did defeat all the black knights in a round, I still had a good time in my attempts to do so. I saved Asteroids Deluxe for last because there's a huge issue here with this game at the time I'm recording this. Now, we've seen errors come up from time to time, like little game bugs popping up, or maybe the wrong artwork being used, and even the broken version of a ROM being included in at least one case. And fortunately, over time, Blaze Entertainment has the ability and has been fixing these issues little by little via firmware updates, although it is unfortunate that these errors and bugs are present on the initial release. But the problem in this instance is the biggest and the most baffling. The collection is advertised as including Asteroids Deluxe, and the game box, the manual, and the menu all indicate that this is Asteroids Deluxe. However, this is not Asteroids Deluxe. Instead, it's the original Asteroids with the Asteroids Deluxe overlay being used. Now, the two games are pretty similar, and in fact, Asteroids Deluxe was initially created as a harder version of Asteroids with a few element changes, such as your ship taking on a different appearance and a new enemy in the form of a killer satellite, and the change from a hyperspace button to a shields button. But even if you are unfamiliar with all of that, there are 2 things that should have been a red flag immediately that this was the wrong game. Firstly, the vector graphics in Asteroids Deluxe are light blue, whereas they're white in Asteroids. And the copyright date that is at the bottom of the screen is 1979 for Asteroids, while it's 1980 for Asteroids Deluxe, despite the game not actually releasing until 1981. Somebody added the wrong game ROM to the cartridge and somehow nobody noticed before release. Well, this will more than likely be corrected via firmware update. As of the making of this video, the most recent firmware revision of 2.0.2 has not fixed this issue. And when it does get fixed, will they simply swap the ROMs so there's no longer access to Asteroids? Or perhaps will Asteroids still be playable in addition to Asteroids Deluxe? I guess that the ROMs would simply be swapped since Asteroids wasn't even supposed to be in this collection. So how do I talk about a game that's supposed to be included and isn't here? And I can't really talk about Asteroids because it might be removed in a future update. And it's a shame because I really like Asteroids and I got hooked playing it for an hour or so while capturing footage. Well, until this mix-up gets resolved, I'll just have to say that I don't really like the fact that the wrong game is included here, and I'll just have to play Asteroids Deluxe when it's actually included in this collection. And that's all 13 games from Atari Arcade 1. Mainly classic games in this collection, but unfortunately 9 of the 13 games originally used some sort of analog controller in the form of a trackball or a spinner, and that doesn't always translate very well to a digital controller. And that certainly affected how I felt about many of these games. So, in spot number 13, I've got to put Asteroids Deluxe, simply because it's not Asteroids Deluxe. The Asteroids ROM was mistakenly used instead, and it's not that I don't like Asteroids, but the fact that I really disliked that the wrong game was included. This would have ranked much higher if it was the correct game. At number 12 is Pong, not just because the paddles are more difficult to control with a digital input, but also because the game doesn't seem to operate properly. At number 11 is Crystal Castles, a game I was never really fond of, but also find it much more frustrating without the analog control of a trackball. At number 10 is Super Breakout, again another game that suffers without the analog control of a spinner. And then at number 9, we jump to games I actually did like, starting with Night Driver, a game that controlled surprisingly well without an analog steering wheel. At number 8 is Canyon Bomber, the simplistic one-button game that wound up being more entertaining than I expected. At the halfway point at number 7 is Liberator, probably the most obscure title in the collection that attempts to reimagine the Missile Command formula. Number 6 is Warlords, a fun game for up to 4 players that worked better than I expected without the analog controls of a spinner. At number 5 is Centipede, the classic arcade game that's still playable without the analog trackball, but would definitely be better with one. And number 4 is Millipede, which I had to put just over Centipede because it's pretty much the same game, but I like how the changes make the gameplay just a little bit more chaotic. And the third spot is Missile Command, another classic I find works rather well without the analog trackball controller. And number 2 is Lunar Lander, a game I know a lot of people don't like, but I've always really liked these Lander-type games. And my favorite game of the collection is Skydiver, a game I could play for a lengthy amount of time just seeing if I could beat my previous high scores. And that's going to wrap it up for Atari Arcade 1. As of the recording of this video, the next Evercade collection isn't out yet, and even though we're returning to console releases, I'm really looking forward to playing the 12 games that will be included in cartridge number 23, the Renovation Collection 1, which will be released sometime in March alongside the Gremlin Collection 1. I just realized that those collections will probably be available before this video goes live, so maybe I'll have videos for those collections up sooner rather than later. Who knows? Well, catch you next time.